My name is Majeed Dahiru. I'm just a humble journalist and newspaper columnist who happens to love Nigeria. And like our father said, my being on this stage today was like a coup as well by the organizers, because until a few hours ago, I didn't know I'll be here. And just like General Yakubu Gowon was not aware of the coup that made him head of state, I wasn't aware of the coup that brought me here as keynote speaker. But I will try and have a conversation. It's not going to be a lecture because I'm not a lecturer. It's just a conversation that will spur further conversations around the theme of this gathering, which is ethical and value-driven leadership as a solution to national development. So I paraphrased, my little thoughts that I've put down here as Nigeria, a nation divided in oneness and in urgent need of reconfiguration. Long before our erudite scholar and Nobel laureate publicly made his own submission about reconfiguration, I have for a long time used that anecdote in my several seminars and essays, as well as public analysis about the challenges confronting Nigeria. And so without much ado, I would like to start this conversation with a true life story. Because sometimes I feel that those of us that do analysis on TV, on radio, we can be accused of analysis paralysis sometimes. I mean, it's becoming too much. So sometimes we need to break it down into granular details that can be easily related with. So, looking at Nigeria, I'd like to share a true life story. In the 90s, I lived in Lagos before moving to Abuja in the early 2000s. And there was this hotel somewhere in Lagos where I lived. The hotel was apparently built by an ex-serviceman who used his fringe benefits and gratuity to put up the edifice as a family business. And so it was, well run, very successful. It was the choice destination for fun seekers all around my area, and so all of us were patrons of that place. So it was a thriving business that brought considerable revenue to the family that owned the business. But there was a problem in that family. Apparently, the man was a polygamous African, like most of us here, except me. And so he had 3 wives, plenty of children. And as is usual with the case of mismanagement of polygamy or the home front, so apparently there was an absence of equity, fairness, in his own administration of his family. So, of course, he loved the section more than others, and so all of the issues that arises from such relationships, mismanagement, was very rife in his family. And so, while he didn't quite pay attention to the senior children from his first 2 wives, and so they were disempowered and became a burden upon him because they couldn't have economic empowerment, lack of education, and all and opportunities. The younger wife that he loved most, he indulged her children, so they became equally spoiled, and they didn't see the need to work hard, believing that daddy was a very rich man. And so there was crisis at home, serious crisis. There was division, ordinarily one family, but there was division, there was strife, no love, no empathy, nothing. So it was just like a household that wasn't really a family. And so suddenly the man died. In all of this chaos, died suddenly. And so all daggers were drawn, because right now is to share the property, because there was no will left behind. And even if there was a will, the atmosphere in the family was such that you couldn't read a will that might not favor one group or one section over the other. And so to avoid all of the crisis, the elders of the family, concerned elders, called a family meeting. I said, look, having looked at all the situation, all the circumstances around here, the solution to this brewing crisis is simple. So children that belong to wife A or section A, you are going to proceed to the hotel every Sunday evening to collect all the revenues accruable to the hotel from Monday up until that point. And so wife B and your children too, you send the representative the following week from that same Sunday evening to the following Sunday, you collect all the revenues accruable. And so for the 3rd section. So it appeared very, very equitable and very fair, but that is where the problem started from. So the first week, wife A's representative, most likely the senior child, went to the hotel manager after 1 week and said, how much was generated during the week, so I need to take the share of my own section of the family. So they handed him a wad of cash, but told him that he needed to drop a little bit of money for replenishing some of the, toiletries, maintenance fees, and all. And he said no. He protested. Now you have to wait until the following week for the other family to give you any deductions for what you're talking about. On this one that I've collected, nothing is going to be given back. And so the trend continued across the three sections of the family. So it was taken and continuously taken without anybody putting hands on deck to make sure that even the revenue base was expanded. So many years later, I went to Lagos, and I decided to go there as a fund seeker. So I met a dilapidated building that was reptile infested, and I was told that the children of this family are all on the street now. Some are for organizers, some are cattle riders. So in essence, the family collapsed, the business collapsed, because as members of the same family, they couldn't come together to build before sharing, to bake before sharing. And that is the story of Nigeria. And that is why, since 1960, quality leadership, the kind of leadership that this conference seeks to have a conversation about, ethical, morally upright, is a leadership that simply is a leadership. Basic qualities of leadership has eluded Nigeria because, essentially, Nigeria has failed to function as a nation and has remained a country for most parts of its history as an independent country. And so, it is without doubt that an absence of an integrity-based political leadership in Africa's largest democracy, that is high on morals and ethical values, have ensured a stunted national development within the context of a united, socially cohesive, secure and prosperous Nigerian nation. In fact, as a matter of fact, it will seem that Nigeria has been plagued by more of corrupt, inept, and incompetent political leadership in various forms throughout its existence as an independent country. That Nigeria is currently confronted on multiple fronts with heightened insecurity, ranging from Boko Haram insurgency in the northeast, banditry in the northwest, violent clashes between farmers and herders across the country, and oil theft, as well as sea piracy in the Niger Delta region, is a consequence of leadership failure of its political class. With various armed groups controlling large swathes of land and ungoverned spaces, and unleashing terror on defenseless citizens, maiming, killing, kidnapping, robbing, and displacing thousands from their homes, farmlands, and other places of work, it will seem that Nigeria is in a state of undeclared war. Unfortunately, an undeclared war, not against a foreign enemy, but an undeclared war against its own self. Added to the mounting problem of insecurity is also the worsening economic situation in the country. With a growing population now exceeding 200 million people, but sources of national revenues still largely dependent on some 2 million barrels per day oil money, it has become abundantly clear that revenues generated from the internal exploitation of Nigeria's rich deposit of hydrocarbons alone are not enough to sustain the socio-economic development of Nigerians, hence the growing problem of unemployment, poverty, hunger, and destitution. Nigeria's inability to cater adequately for its citizens is the reason Nigeria has sunk into an all-time low in Human Development Index as the poverty capital of the world, and one that is one of the most terrorized globally. And so the road of corruption, as well as economic and financial crimes that appears endemic in government at all levels in Nigeria, cannot be overemphasized. The pervasive culture of corruption, such as nepotism, cronyism, favoritism, sectionalism, that more often than not resort into the stealing of public funds, is something that Nigeria has had to endure for much of its lifetime as an independent nation. Nigeria's steady decline in Transparency International corruption perception ratings in recent years is a clear indication of Nigeria's worsening problem of corruption. Nigeria's corruption-induced socioeconomic problems have contributed immensely to Nigeria's heightened problem of insecurity. Therefore, there is a nexus between corruption, economic dislocation, and insecurity. And this should open a frank and robust conversation about the roots of Nigeria's fundamental and seemingly intractable problem of corruption that now pose an existential threat to the continuous corporate existence of the most populous black nation in the world. In the face of mounting corruption-induced economic and security challenges that has weakened the Nigerian state to such an extent that governments at all tiers and arms are increasingly finding it difficult, if not impossible, to carry out their primary functions of providing for the welfare and security of citizens, as enshrined in Section 14.2 of the 1999 Constitution amended, has led many to believe that Nigeria may be inching closer to the end stage of state failure. The anxiety, concern, and palpable fear over the collapse of our dear country, on the positive side, affords us an opportunity to put on our thinking caps and open our minds and reflect sincerely on how we are collectively, as a people, driving Nigeria down the road to a failed state destination. The aim of bringing up practical solutions that can pull Nigeria back from the brink of state collapse. Although seemingly worse off today, the underlying socio-cultural issues that are driving Nigeria's existential problems of corruption-induced dislocation of many able-bodied young men and women, leading them into sundry acts of violence, criminality, and terrorism, did not start with the current administration. Neither did the problem begin in 1999, when the transition from military to civil democratic rule took effect. The problems of Nigeria began before the beginning of Nigeria's journey to nationhood in 1960. And these problems have its root causes in the disunity, just like that family I talked about earlier, in the disunity and the associated unresolved question of national unity. Convinced that the constituent peoples of Nigeria were irreconcilably different to such an extent that a united, strong, and virile Nigerian nation could not evolve from the 1914 British-created country of Nigeria, our founding fathers will go on to negotiate an independent Nigeria with a federating unit or structure that is structured along ethnogeographic fault lines, from the regions to the provinces to the native authorities. And whereas the first public Nigerian federation of 3 and later 4 regions substantially satisfied the requirements of physical federalism, its structural rigidity along ethnogeographic fault lines without a mechanism, an inherent mechanism for the assimilation and integration of Nigerians wherever they choose to reside outside their region of origin, with full political and economic rights extended to them effectively, made Nigeria a country of indigenous tribesmen of over 500 ethnic nationalities, and not a nation of citizens. And so the crude contestation for power of resource control by the many ethnogeographic groupings over Nigeria's internally generated resources will find expression in the cancer of politics of ethnic and religious identity. And so as a representative democracy, the First Republic Federation that was structured along ethnic fault lines inevitably gave rise to a political culture of ethnic and regional as well as religious identity. And with identity politics becoming entrenched in our polity, meant that democratic leadership recruitment process of Nigeria's political leaders were primarily driven by the primordial sentiments of ethnicity, region of origin, and religion. Consequently, the post-independent political leadership class of Nigeria, in their bid to retain their privileged positions, devised sundry means to deepen the dividing ethnogeographic fault lines by influencing their respective peoples to always align their democratic choices with their ethnicities, region of origin, and religion. This was how a solid foundation for a Nigerian state that would increasingly be weakened by the ravages of identity politics up until this day in 2024 was laid and concretized 64 years earlier at our independence in 1960. Unfortunately, Nigeria will once again embrace identity politics fully following the transition from military to civil democratic rule in 1999. Retrogressive in nature, identity politics is divisive, it is parochial, it is bigoted, and it negates every norm of modern nation building. And if identity politics is allowed to take root in the political system of any country, as has been the case of Nigeria in the 24 years of democracy, it will spread like a cancerous cell and sap life out of this country. Sadly, after 24 years of civil democratic rule, Nigeria and the promise of dividends of democracy in the form of improved welfare and security of lives and properties remain largely elusive, no thanks to our collective wrong purveyance of identity politics, which has made us victims of corruption in any case, but we are purveyors of that which we have become victims of. In identity politics, the seeds of corruption were sown. This is so because the only reward system for identity politics is patronage at the expense of the public treasury. Therefore, such corrupt practices as nepotism, cronyism, tribalism, favoritism, and all forms of isms are legitimate cultural tools by which elected political representatives of the over 500 ethnic nationalities in Nigeria in government use to extract from the center, or what you call the national cake, to the various sections of the country with themselves as the major beneficiaries. And so corruption, with its debilitating effects, has become intractable and endemic because in Nigeria, this ugly phenomenon is sanctioned by culture, and because Nigeria has also added a problem to itself, which is a competition between the two leading religious groupings in Nigeria over the soul of this country. And so corruption has also become sanctioned by religion. While Nigeria may not be a failed state yet, our beloved country is undoubtedly exhibiting mild symptoms of state failure, which includes but are not limited to the loss of control of territories and monopoly of the use of legitimacy of force within those territories. Also, an increasing erosion of legitimate authority to make collective decisions and the inability to adequately provide public services. It is important to note that the causative pathogen for the aforementioned symptoms of state failure is always and almost the inability of failed states to resolve their questions of national identity as a means of achieving a united, just, fair, egalitarian, and strong nation state. From British India, Somalia, Sudan, to Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, as well as Yemen, the absence of an inclusive and pragmatic political leadership to harmonize the preponderance of ethnogeographic and religious identity dissonance through an excellent diversity management system in line with the rule of law is fundamentally responsible for the fragility, failure, and collapse of some of these countries. In India, the inability of post-colonial political leaders of that country to harmonize religious identity of its Muslim and Hindu peoples resulted into the breakaway of Pakistan in 1947. Similarly, the split of Sudan into North and South in 2011 was caused by the poor diversity management of its political leaders who could not provide an inclusive leadership for its Black African, Christian, Arab, Muslim, and non-Arab Muslim peoples. Today, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq are embroiled in a devastating sectarian war between its Sunni and Shiite communities, which has all but resulted into the near-total state collapse of these countries. Nigeria and troubled countries such as Yemen, Syria, Sudan, Lebanon, and Iraq have something strikingly in common. Their leadership recruitment process are firmly hinged on politics of ethnogeographic and religious identity, which has given rise to sectional, parochial, clannish, bigoted, divisive leadership, and of course, a very corrupt political class. Many historians and commentators have attributed Nigeria's problem of identity dissonance to the colonial misadventure of lumping together different peoples without having much in common by the British colonial authorities. Variously described as a mere geographic expression that was a mistake, Nigeria, it would seem, was programmed to fail even before it started. However, are we to continue to blame the past for the present, or should the present start taking responsibility for the future? 107 years after amalgamation and 64 years after independence, and of course 24 years into civil democratic rule in the Fourth Republic, with the promise of a united, strong, and prosperous nation state still elusive, now is the time to reflect appropriately on our yesterday with the aim of making tomorrow better, starting from doing the right thing today. You cannot have, in a country like Nigeria, an ethical and morally upright leadership given the current system of identity politics. And that is what, as a people, we must work towards overcoming. And so, in this conversation, it is not a blame game between the leadership and the people. I think it's a collective responsibility because the leadership are simply a product of a system that has corruption as a reward system and not good governance. But in trying to overcome our identity challenges, we must retell the history of Nigeria. We must develop a new national belief system that seeks to bring unity, not just in diversity, but to actually illustrate that Nigeria has been a case of a country that is divided in oneness. Because as far as I'm concerned, essentially, Nigerians are one people. So contrary to the entrenched narrative that says Nigeria is a country of people with too much irreconcilable differences to be a united nation, historical and sociological evidences suggest otherwise. The peoples of Nigeria, long before the British amalgamation of 1914, shared deep and close cultural, linguistic, and traditional ties within a common geographic area extending beyond the borders of modern-day Nigeria into Benin, into Niger, into Cameroon, and Chad republics. Nigeria is a mostly monoracial black African country. And the various ethnic groups, tribes, and kingdoms of pre-colonial Nigeria have interacted through diplomacy, through trade, and warfare, as the case may be, which served to integrate the peoples of Nigeria long before independence. There was a pre-existing traditional citizenship system in Nigeria before colonial era, which allowed for the seamless assimilation and integration of individuals, families, and communities wherever they choose to reside within the Nigeria of old. If diversity is to be measured in terms of racial composition of a geographic entity, then a monoracial Nigeria hardly qualifies to be described as a diverse country. Nigeria is best described as a plural country because the various ethnic groupings, such as the Hausa, the Igbo, the Yoruba, the Ijaw, the Nupe, the Igala, the Tiv, the Kanu, the etc., are simply a plurality of the same one big black African linguistic and cultural family. While by no means justifying colonialism, it is important to state that the greatest nations in the world were once colonies of superior powers. And that includes, of course, Great Britain. Nigeria's colonial master was a Roman colony between 43 and 410 AD. And the black monoracial peoples of Nigeria bear a striking resemblance to those who colonized us. You see, we need to retell our history in order to resolve that conflict in our psychology about whether or not we can truly be a people with a common and shared Nigerian identity, or are we going to continue to wallow in the division in Nigeria that has created the current leadership challenge? And so, the black monoracial peoples of Nigeria share a lot with white Britain, because Britain was simply also a pluralistic society of ethnicities. So for instance, Sir George Goldie, who played the biggest role in the formation of modern Nigeria, was Scottish, just as Flora Shaw, the British essayist whose suggestion was the name Nigeria, was of Irish ancestry. And at the time of the amalgamation of the southern and northern protectorates in Nigeria, the British crown was sitting on the head of King George V, an ethnic German, who was the grandson of Queen Victoria by her consort Prince Albert of Germany. And so it is the same thing with us. Whether you are Igbo, Yoruba, Hausa, whatever, it's not different from the British, being Irish, Welsh, Scottish, etc. But they were able to recognize their oneness. And so they left the British Isle and sailed for thousands of nautical miles to this continent and colonized us. And so, given the fact that in modern times, nations are essentially well-run corporate entities that are competing for global resources, Nigeria cannot achieve any form of national development without joining this race for global resource pursuit. As long as we remain a country that is divided within and sharing Nigeria's internally-generated revenue, we will not attain the desired leadership that will take us from this point to the next. So one of the biggest lessons not learned from history is that the unity of Nigeria is a condition that must precede its socioeconomic development. There is no country in the world, not one, from the United States of America to the United Kingdom, to the United Arab Emirates, to China, there is not a single country in the world that has attained any form of national development enough to have adequate welfare and security for citizens without first attaining social cohesion, national unity. It is impossible. And so what I've enumerated before getting to this point is to illustrate that the major challenge confronting Nigeria is deep divisions along multi, ethno, geographic, and other identities in thousands. And there is no country in the world that will make any form of progress without first overcoming this challenge. And that is why Nigeria's democracy cannot yield the kind of morally upright and value-driven leadership that we yearn until we first correct that which is wrong with our identity politics that has driven our democratic leadership recruitment process since 1999. Therefore, the problem of disunity of Nigeria and its people was not caused by nature but by politics. And it will require a deliberate political process backed by a purposeful administrative procedure that seeks to transform Nigeria from just a country into a nation. And as long as Nigerians continue to wallow themselves to be divided along ethnographic fault lines, they would have granted an irrevocable power of attorney to our political leaders to continuously divide and misrule us. Therefore, guided by the self-enlightened realization that Nigeria is not essentially a diverse country, but one that is simply pluralistic. There is no difference between a thief man, an Idoma man, and an Igede man in Benue. There is no difference between a Hausa man, an Igbo man, and a Yoruba man. And our history suggests such. I'll tell you something today. For those of you that are Yorubas, you refer to your deities, your traditional deities as Orishas, right? I can assure you that the Igbos of Southeast refer to what you call Orisha as Olisa. And the Ebiras of north-central Nigeria also refer to what you call Orisha, Olisa as Oricha. This was before colonialism. And when the Yorubas want to approach their Orisha, they do it through a medium called Ifa. Yes, the Igbos do it through a medium when they want to approach the Olisa, through a medium called Afa. And the Ebiras in north-central do it through a medium also called Eva. So it tells you that even in our African cosmology, the oneness of the Nigerian people is well entrenched. And so what you see as diversity and plurality is simply the beautiful feathers of one big bird. That bird is Nigeria. And so all of us are simply members of the same household, living in different parts of the family compound. Until we have this understanding, we will not be able to align our democratic choices with pragmatic issues of economy, security, and environmental concern. We will keep voting for ethnicities. You keep voting for your tribes. You keep voting for your religion. And then we're expecting a miracle. And because when you vote for tribe and religion, what you get as a reward is not going to be good governance. It's going to be patronage in form of appointment, in form of inflated contracts, and general corrupt practices. And so to escape our current quandary, and if we ever have a hope that our democracy can yield a morally upright and ethical leadership, it will be for us, through a deliberate political process, to reconfigure the Nigerian state along the lines of modern nation states, where the principles of democratic citizenship, national integration, social cohesion are well entrenched, and where our politics will be driven by pragmatic issues of economic concern, collective economic concern, collective environmental concerns, collective security concerns, it is only then that we can begin to enter into a social contract between us as a people and those that aspire to lead us along ethical and moral value-driven lines. The man we are gathered here to celebrate today, the late Umar Musa Yar'Adua, was like a Moses out of the palace of Pharaoh of Egypt. Why do I say so? Yes, he was honed through the same system. But when he became president, he dared to be different. And the results are clearly etched in history. First, as an avowed apostle of rule of law, he made sure that he led this country with the principles of equity, justice, and fairness. And throughout the Fourth Republic, the period between 2007 and 2010 was the most united, most prosperous, and most stable in terms of economics and security matters in the history of the Fourth Republic. That was because he embodied the ideals of a pan-Nigerian leadership that we require to resolve our major challenges. And so what did he do? Though not from the Niger Delta, he was able to feel the pain of the Niger Delta people. Enough to say, look, Nigeria has not been fair to the Niger Delta. And so what do? We need to carry out a remediation. And so he granted that amnesty, created the Ministry of Niger Delta, and extended an olive branch to the people that populate the region that lays the golden egg for us all to benefit from. And peace was brought to Niger Delta, and we saw an upsurge in the production of crude oil. It didn't stop there. Umar Musa Yar'Adua was the first president since 1999, and as a matter of fact, the first leader since the First Republic to appoint a Nigerian of Southeast origin as the Inspector General of the Nigerian Police Force. And that was why throughout his tenure, you didn't get to see any agitation about Biafra separatist movement, because every part of this country was carried along in an equitable manner that did not discriminate and did not marginalize. And so there's a nexus between such a charismatic, good leader, may God rest his soul, who presided over the golden era of the Fourth Republic, was the period between 2007 and 2010. He improved on every indices of development that he met on ground. He increased our foreign reserve from $35 to $45 billion. He increased the savings in the excess crude account from $9.8 billion to over $15 billion. And guess what? In that era where they removed subsidy to punish the people, Umar Musa Yar'Adua increased subsidy on petroleum when he came on board and made the price of a liter of petrol at 75 naira, and he reduced it to 65 naira without complaining for 4 good years. He didn't complain, he didn't lose with bags of rice and bags of millet. He gave us energy security, and that was why the minimum wage then was adequate and was able to take us home at the end of the month. And so if we need to have another leadership that will be in the mode of Umar Musa Yar'Adua, it cannot happen by mistake the way it's happened. It's not every time you'll be lucky to have a Moses out of the household of Pharaoh. We need a deliberate movement towards pulling back the ravages of identity politics and practice pragmatic politics that can unite us around a common cause for national development. Thank you very much.